I think projector 2 might be dead. Projector 1 might be dead. All right, projector 1 appears to be dead, so you're just going to have to look at the one over my shoulder. That'll make it easier. Alrighty. Okay. I looked up from what I was doing at 2:55, and I was like, oh, it's almost 3 o'clock. And I was like, why is that significant? It's not. Geez, I think I even left my pen in my office. That's how fast I ran out. Okay. Good times. I wonder if I can do this with my finger. I will try. Whee. All right, we'll do what we can. So, it won't be as nice. Okay, we were talking last time. Where were we? We were talking last time about some of the interesting kind of things that Haidt points out when he's talking about technology, right? When he's talking about specifically the impact of smartphones. Oh. Nope, that's a different thing. Oh yeah, I thought maybe my pen was in there. About smartphones on mental health, right? And kind of the thing he pointed out was that we have, a pretty consistent link between hours spent on social media and, poor mental health outcomes. So really starting in, 2010, when we get the iPhone 4 and the Galaxy S launched with front-facing cameras, and then linking that to Instagram's founding and the fact that, Instagram being a visual media that's pretty much selfie-based, growing its user base so quickly after it's purchased by Facebook really seems to drive a different mode of social media. And as I said, girls really engage with visually based media, first Instagram and then TikTok, and then boys really move into video games. They've been going there for a while, but they increase their engagement with video games and, add things like YouTube and then Reddit, and of course, hardcore porn. Okay. So we ended off on this slide and we covered a couple of points, right? So I think I had left it here with these kinds of points. But basically, one of the things that Haidt wants to tell us is that play is really important in mammalian species, right? And for most of our history, right, most of human, kind of human history, one of the things that kids did a lot was play and would do what we would call free play, right? Undirected, unstructured kind of playing with other human beings, right? Go out in the world and just play, right? Sometimes, under parental supervision, but often not, right? Now, what is the value of this? So, all sorts of things, right? You learn to navigate your environment. You know what's dangerous. You know what you're allowed to do, right? You test your body. You test your limitations. You practice skills that you're going to use later as an adult, right? Things like, hunting or social skills with other people, right? You practice things in joking and teasing and gossiping, right? How to interact with people. How far you could have taken my Intro to Social Methods class, you'll know that your face, Jasmine. One of my callbacks and the joke that I constantly go back to is just talking about furries as an example of something you could do social research on. And I trust me when I say it gets funnier every time I talk about it. So play with others, though. The other thing it does is it allows a certain degree of risk, right? When you're playing, you get to take certain risks, right? Social risks, some physical risks, but usually in environments that mean you won't get hurt seriously. And if you get hurt, right, you learn how not to do the things that are going to get you hurt, right? Don't jump off that, it's too high. Don't build a ramp and run your bike off of it out of plywood, because the plywood's going to break and you're going to fall off and hurt yourself, right? But play is important in figuring out physical boundaries for kids, right? So there's some risk when we talk about play, right? But it tends to be ephemeral, right? So it's passing. Whatever happens during play is usually forgotten quickly thereafter. And there are risks, right? You might get hurt, you might get into a fight with someone, but typically it's not very costly, right? It's not something permanent or systemic, right? The other thing is that it is embodied, right? So what does that mean? It means your meat is actually there, right? Your body is present when you are, doing off-screen play. It's synchronous, right? So you're actually there, it's happening in real time, and it's one-to-one or one-to-several, right? And so again, if you think of some of the stuff we talked about in the last couple of units, when we talked about religion and we talked about mental health and things like trusted adults, broadly, those community things and those trusted adults, these are things that are embodied synchronous and one-to-one or one-to-several, right? You are physically present in a place doing a thing, and that, broadly seems to help human beings. Okay, now Haidt contrasts this to a phone-based childhood, right? And we'll talk about what a phone-based childhood looks like, but it's disembodied, it's asynchronous, right, often, right? So, if you're doing things like playing video games, you're often not doing it at the same time as other people. I know online games have changed that a little bit, but your body's definitely not there. Or social media, right? Something like Instagram. People are looking at Instagram or TikTok at different times. And yeah, it's not one-to-one or one-to-several. It's one-to-many, right? It's a mass medium when you get to phone-based childhoods. Okay. Short-form video content. I might be looking for that term. Okay, so phone-based childhood, right? Now, what I would say is, I would probably slightly modify, and I don't think Jonathan would have any issues with this, the term to say screen-based childhood instead of a phone-based childhood. But basically, this is the kind of opposite, not the opposite, rather. This is a sort of more recent form of childhood that's developed as the number of screens in young people's lives has multiplied, right? And, I'll point up at this chart again. And as we've basically gone into a screen-based childhood, the amount meeting up with friends, so the amount of time people spend with their friends for both boys and girls has declined pretty precipitously. Okay, now the little gray area here, I'll explain later as we go through, but this is a period that basically Haidt, I'll use a highlighter to just color in a little bit so you know what I'm talking about, right? Did I just use a pen? Oh, yeah. Right, okay, so this section here, right, this gray section, basically is 2011 to about 2015, a period that Haidt and Twenge refer to as the Great Rewiring, right? A period where they think essentially the technologies that we were using and the technologies that were introduced in that period sort of rewired a lot of human experiences, especially for the young, right? So this is a period of kind of exceptional technological change and a lot of social and cultural adaptation to that. And, big changes. I need to put my pen back to a better color. Okay, so compared to, play-based childhood, phone-based childhood or screen-based childhood is largely mediated through devices. And Haidt refers to phones and any other kinds of screens as experience blockers, right? They're things that rather than enhancing experiences, actually sort of get in the way of experiences, right? So you're not open to new types of experience or exploring. And what he says is that every second that you spend on a phone screen, right? Every second that you spend on Instagram or on a tablet or on your laptop or staring at Netflix or, on the PlayStation 4 or 5, I guess 5 now, or, whatever it happens to be, whatever screen you are glued to is a second that you're not doing something out in the real world, right? Now he says, and I quote, "This is the world that young humans evolve to participate, or to, it's the world that young humans evolve to participate in, right? Is in-person synchronous activities, because our brains haven't really changed that much in hundreds of thousands of years, right? We are very much, or very similar to the modern humans, on the African savanna from about, I want to say about 100,000 years ago. It might be a little longer. My paleontology timeline is not that good, right? So it's this is an argument about opportunity costs, right? Oops, not laser pointer. Opportunity costs is basically, everything that you do has a certain trade-off, right? If you are watching TV, you can't be doing something else, right? If you are playing, what's that game? Minecraft, right? You're not outside with your friends in person. You might be online with them, but you're not with them in person. Okay. So increasingly, and especially for social media, right? And so this is particularly true for girls. It's a little bit less true for boys. Life online seems to force a couple of things. One is this very, very, I don't want to say long-term thinking. He calls them, oops, that looks terrible. We're going to erase that bad highlighting and put better highlighting on. Light blue, right? What he suggests is that young people, especially with social media, start to think more like brand managers than kids having experiences, right? Because the internet has a sort of permanence to it, right? And we think of here, cancel culture, where people are digging up things that you said in the past online and using them against you, right? And there's lots of really prominent examples of this. People who've lost jobs and opportunities for things that they said online, maybe years before, because someone who didn't like them went digging through their Twitter timeline or their Instagram post, right, and found something considered untowards today, even if that thing wasn't untowards at the time, right? So rather than being kind of present-centered and thinking about the moment that they're in, what Haidt contends is that social media especially, and screen-based culture, makes people sort of conscious about the long-term implications, the social consequence well into the future. And so, often what they're doing is not for its own sake, to the point where, one of the experiences a lot of people report of social media is that they feel alienated from their own social media, right? Where they've curated a certain persona online so much that it's not really them and it doesn't represent who they are. It's maybe more aspirational than anything, right? Okay, so along with that, back to the pen, he suggests that phones take you out of the moment. He uses fancy schmancy language, blunt attunement, right? But basically it takes you out of the moment in numerous ways. Parents are more distracted, right? And especially even parents of young kids, kids that are, infants, toddlers, preschoolers and early school years are often on their phones, right? Guilty as charged. I do this all the time, right? At the end of the day, I'm tired. I sometimes just want to go on my phone and not pay attention to my kids, but your kids want your attention, right? So parents are more distracted to the point where in her book, what is it? Reclaiming Conversation. This is really hard with my finger. Worse than the pen. Reclaiming Conversation. Sherry Turkle has a whole chapter entitled Dad, stop Googling, I just want to talk to you, right? Where it's basically like, and she lays out this scenario where, a young person asks their parent a question. And instead of just having a conversation about something, the parent immediately picks up their phone and is like, hey, I know, I'll look up the answer on Google, right? Really interesting book. I used to teach it in this class. It's gotten a little bit dated, so I replaced it with Height. But parents are more distracted, right? And increasingly think of like phones at the dinner table is one of the big complaints, right? If people are even having dinner together at all, often parents, are bringing phones and they're text messaging or they're doing their email or, playing a game when they should be having that kind of high quality social interaction. It's going to teach a lot of those social skills, right? So parents are more distracted. Those phones, the devices, we're all guilty of it, right? They're super attractive to most of us. And so they take us out of the real world. Less synchronous time with friends, right? That's what we got here. We're spending less time with people, right? And if might have been in the last lecture, the one on mental health, right? The decline in time spent with friends, especially amongst the youngest cohort, has been super sharp. It really starts, kind of in the early to mid 2000s, but it really kicks in after, smartphones and other smart devices kind of come in, right? So that time was time that you spent, talking about common culture, making jokes, dancing together, singing the same songs, right? Basically being in the same place at the same time in kind of synchronous ways. Even some things like, gaming used to be done a lot more synchronously by boys, right? So like I remember back in, the Stone Age, in the late 90s and early 2000s, I would get together with all of my friends. One of my friends would bring over like Nintendo 64 and we would all play GoldenEye, right? On the same TV, in the same room. And when you got mad at your friend for shooting you in the head for the 400th time because you suck at GoldenEye and they have a Nintendo 64 so they rock at it, you would punch them, right? It was good times. Or throw popcorn at them and then your mom yells at you like, don't throw food. True story. Less synchronous time, right, as we spend more time apart. And so one of the things that Height sort of thinks happens here is we get less common experiences and less common rituals. And this matters a lot, right, when we start to talk about social cohesion. Right? If you want to put in very Durkheimian terms, the less time people have together, the less time they spend doing things together, common rituals, the less they have in common and the more social polarization is going to tend to come out of that, right? Because you don't have anything binding you together. You just have a whole bunch of centrifugal forces kind of spinning society apart. Okay, so I made this tea at 1 o'clock and it is still too hot to drink. Why are the tears of my students so hot? I don't know. Okay, it must be because it's final season. Those final papers you have to write cause steaming hot tears. All right, so, or my mug is just too good. One concept, or two concepts that Height takes from these two theorists, Rob Boyd and Pete Rickardson, is prestige bias and conformist bias. And what he says is that, and these two study, gene culture coevolution. So if you want to, go into some really kind of high and difficult academic literature, culture gene coevolution, right? And I'm forgetting the term now. There's a term for how culture and social circumstances can affect your genetics. Epigenetics. It's epigenetics, right? So largely this is a study of what's called epigenetics. But how, so epigenetics, right? How culture and genetics kind of work together in major ways. And one of the things that he takes, right, from Boyd and Rickardson is that basically there are two cultural strategies that human beings have that relate to our propensity to live together and form kind of cultures. And these are what they call conformist and prestige bias. All right, now these ideas are relatively simple to understand, right? So conformist bias, what is it? Well, going back to kind of, very early in human evolution, human beings are group animals, right? Basically, we survive based on our ability, largely because we're really smart comparatively to other animals. So we're really smart and we're really good at working with each other, right? Development of language and tools and all of those things really help us to work together. But that comes with some genetic baggage. One of the things that is really, really important to us is we want to fit into the group, right? And you see this really strongly in teenagers, right? If something happens, on social media, right, or with friends, even prior to social media, right? If you get rejected by the group, right, people start gossiping about you, people start kind of, talking behind your back or anything like that, it causes almost immediate anxiety, right? To be left out causes, fear, anxiety, worry, all sorts of really challenging emotion. Why? Well, because from an evolutionary perspective, you getting kicked out of the group meant you were more likely to get eaten by a tiger, right? Just like straight up, there are scary things in the world. Human beings kind of suck at defending themselves, right? Our teeth are useless. Our nails are not that great compared to a tiger's claws. We're not particularly fast. We're not particularly strong by any standards. The only thing we are is we get together, we work together really well, and we're really, really smart. So we have this bias towards conformity to help us fit into groups, right? So one of the things that social media does, right, according to Haidt, is it offers rapid fire and essentially a constant stream of information on what everyone is doing. I did not do that little spike on purpose. So it will tend to push us towards greater and greater conformity with groups, right? And more information coming out all the time about what it is to conform. Okay, so prestige bias, right? Now this is a kind of, again, a normal part of human societies is, as people, and especially as young people, we tend to want to associate with the best models we have available, right? Now, if you look at kind of pre-modern societies, right, and you can look, if you want to go into literature, right, look at something like the Iliad, right, Homer's Iliad, or the Odyssey, right? One of the things that's pretty apparent, say, in the Iliad is everybody wants to hang out with Achilles. Why does everyone want to hang out with Achilles? Because he's the best warrior that the Greeks have. And the same with Hector on the Trojan side, right? He's the best warrior, so everybody wants to be buddies with Achilles and Hector. And this is a very normal impulse, right? And I mean, this is the reason that, kids tend to idolize Connor McDavid, right? Or any other sports star or actors or famous singers, because we view them as images of success and we want to mimic that success. So you want to associate with them, right? We tend to want to associate with the best models, right? This would have been in the past like the best hunter in your tribe or the best warrior, or whatever, right? Whatever social role was particularly prominent. Now, this kind of gets, do I have this on the, yes, sorry, I have the hacking part on the next slide. I want to get ahead of myself. Social media tells us through things like likes, views, and algorithmic placement who the best people are, right? Who those top people are. And you think of like, whoever is prominent on social media at any given moment, right? That is, who people will tend to idolize. And trust me, right, I'm raising teenagers right now, and they have been through the gamut so far of people to idolize, right? Starting with these Minecraft YouTubers when they were a little bit younger. My son, just a couple of years ago, it was Mr. Beast this, Mr. Beast that, Mr. Beast this. I'm like, what's a Mr. Beast and why do I have to buy his chocolate? Which I did anyway, but I was like, okay, I'll buy this chocolate. My son's like, this is the best chocolate. I was like, are you sure about that? But whatever, it's okay. But why did he care what Mr. Beast thought and that Mr. Beast was selling chocolate, right? Largely because social media told him that, well, Mr. Beast is the biggest YouTuber on the planet, and so that is the person you want to emulate. So trust me, like for like a whole year, every day, my son was like, Dad, I want to start a YouTube channel. And I'm like, no, absolutely not. But I could do really well at it. And I'm like, yes, that's what I'm afraid of. Not that I don't want my son to succeed. I just, don't want him to be famous. I don't know if that matters. Okay. So these principles, right? So these basic principles of psychology are well understood by the people who are making social platforms. Those people are, no, I'm joking. They're not evil. Totally not in control of my own actions here. They are profit motivated, right? I'm going to erase my joke. Okay. The people who are designing these social media platforms are in large part quite aware of these things, right? They often employ psychologists to help them design these things, right? And so this is a quote from Sean Parker. It's quite a famous one, right? Parker gave this, as part of sort of his testimony against social media and the way that it is designed. And he was early at Facebook, right? And he said the goal of both of Facebook and Instagram's founder, Mark Zuckerberg, the lizard man himself, was to create, a social validation loop, right? So basically, to hijack people's natural inclinations and exploit a vulnerability in human psychology to get you to stay on those platforms for longer, right? Okay. So, according to Haidt, basically social media is all designed around exploiting issues and, I guess, vulnerabilities in human psychology in order to make money off of you, right? It's all about the almighty dollar. I will draw many, many dollar signs. The almighty dollar and how to get as much of it out of your attention as possible, right? So Haidt says, this hacking of our psychology has been particularly troublesome for young people's social development, right? And especially for young people between the ages of 9 and 15. And why? Okay, so online, you see prestigious people who are recognized as such. But because they're virtual rather than embodied, they can't mentor you, right? So in the past, right, you would have gone up to the best, I'm going to just say the hunter in your tribe, right? And you would have tried to convince that person to take you hunting with them, to teach you how they do things, right? And all of that stuff. And it would have been super pro-social and super helpful to you to gain those skills. But increasingly, how likely do you think it is that my now 13-year-old could get mentored by Mr. Beast? Not particularly likely, right? Because how many followers did he have? 22 million or something crazy like that. All of these people, some of them are probably bots, but a lot of young people would probably love to be mentored by Mr. Beast, but that just isn't going to happen. There's only one Mr. Beast, and there's millions of fans, right? As opposed to your, pre-industrial tribe where it was okay, there's 20 kids, so let's, the 4 best hunters, each of them mentor 5 of them, right? A little bit easier to work with. Okay, so they can't mentor us. We might imitate them, right? Which is why my son wants to make his own YouTube channel, but we can't really build relationships with them. And okay, again, think back to that mental health unit and the religion unit, right? What's really important for reducing stress, for making, trusted, I wanted an S there, trusted adults, for making, young people feel good and well-adjusted, right? It is trusted adults, right? The more trusted adults, the better you're doing, right? Now, that said, the more time you spend online shaping that prestige bias towards those people, the less time you have to build those relationships with actual trusted adults out in the real world, right? And those trusted adults are so important for building, your sense of identity, selfhood, building your emotional resilience and all of that, right? And in a world where online is so prominent, those relationships and that aspect of a person is going to develop quite differently. All right, Mr. Beast has 450 million followers. Holy mazzoli. That's 500 million people-ish, more or less. I don't understand. That number is unimaginable. But okay. I'm frightened. I mean, I'm assuming some of those people just follow him for other reasons. Do people hate watch Mr. Beast? One can only hope. Okay, I don't think he's a bad guy. He seems okay. I just, the system is bad. All right. So, 2 other terms that Haidt wants people to think about. So he basically thinks that human beings sort of have 2 modes, right? One he calls discover mode, and again, he's taking this from social psychology. One is he calls discover mode, and one he calls defend mode, right? And he suggests that these evolved basically out of the natural conditions that humans tend to find themselves in, right? In the natural world, before we had, we could ship in strawberries and watermelons and celery from Mexico or for California. Before we could do that, right, you had periods of abundance, summer and fall, and you had periods of scarcity, winter and spring, where there's less food available. So human beings developed psychological adaptations to help them thrive in both. So one of them he calls behavioral activation system, right? And these are terms out of social psychology. And one he calls behavioral inhibition mode. So basically, the behavioral activation system turns on when you detect opportunity, right? And that's when you're more curious, you're more exploratory, right? You're more open to new experiences. Behavioral inhibition mode, or what he calls defend mode, turns on when you detect threats, right? So it can be animals, it can be threats to your survival in terms of resource scarcity, and all sorts of things. Now, people with chronic anxiety are constantly in defend mode. Now, I don't have them handy because they're in the last slideshow, and I'm sorely tempted to actually pull up the mental health slides and just look at the prevalence and growth of anxiety in young people. But if you remember those slides, right, we have a much greater prevalence of young people today than in the past who are depressed and anxious, right? Those diagnoses have gone up all over the place, which suggests, more people are going to be in kind of defend mode. Okay, those people in defend mode tend to be anxious and defensive, closed off to new experiences, less likely to explore, less likely to, confidently head out into the world. Those who are more likely to be, who are in discover mode as a default tend to be happier, more social, eager for new experiences, all things that tend to make you feel happier on the whole. I guess unless you're an introvert, maybe introverts are just, in defend mode all the time. No, that's not true. I'm only making a joke about introverts. So one of these modes, tends to lead to more anxious, troubled people, and it's obviously defend mode, right? Now, one of the things, sorry, let me just go back here for one sec. One of the things that Haidt suggests is that the online media, right, social media in particular, will tend to put people in defend mode, especially adolescent girls especially, more often, because if you think that any misstep you make on social media could damage your social reputation, you are going to likely be slightly defensive at all times, right? And so that idea of that young people, especially young women, approach social media often more as brand managers, right? Managing their online images. suggests that they're going to be in defend mode. They're going to be, doing things like monitoring the environment for threats more often, right? And in defend mode, you're not like going out and just like, I have this like image of like a meadow, frolicking in the meadow of life. You're going to be scanning that meadow in case, in the tall grass there's a lion, right? The lion here is metaphorical. The lion is that girl in your biology class that wants to gossip behind your back and steal your boyfriend, right? Like that's the lion in this metaphor, which now I will abandon. Okay. Anti-fragility. Okay. So I'm going to crap on the Gen Xers, bless you, and the baby boomers for a second here. And millennials too, right? We suck at this. One of the things that Haidt says is that generally speaking, he says children are anti-fragile, which means they're resilient to most of the things that life throws at them, right? They'll face disappointments, injuries, whatever, and they recover from them relatively quickly. Now, my wife hates this term. She's like, if you mean anti-fragile means resilient, why don't you just say resilient? And I'm like, okay, great. Children are mostly resilient, right? Now, what Haidt suggests is that part of being resilient is facing challenges, right? Learning how to actually face difficulties, right, whether they're social or physical, and recover from them, right? And there's been a lot of literature, right, in the last few years on pedagogy and on parenting that have stressed, how to build resilient children. And, to be honest, most of it is complete garbage, right? It's like, I remember this when my daughter was really young. It's like, praise the effort, not the result. Now, if you want to see my daughter get mad about something, praise her effort at something she didn't do well on, right? And she's going to be like, I don't care that I tried my hardest. I suck at this. Which I always thought my wife really loves the parenting podcasts. So she listened to a lot of them. She's like, well, all the experts are saying just praise the effort, not the outcome. And I'm like, she really, really seems to care about the outcome, right? Like she kind of hates that she did bad and she wants to do better. And probably helping her to do better would cause more resilience, but whatever. That's how it goes, right? You need risk, right? And you need to actually fail, right, in order to become resilient. Cushioning people from failure doesn't tend to lead to a lot of resilience. Now, that said, and even just like falling off of things, hurting yourself, getting into fights, right? These are all things that lead to resilience, according to Haidt. Now, one of the things that he suggests is that much of the kind of inborn risk in life was stripped out in the 1990s. And he blames a movement in parenting that sort of comes to be called by sociologists concerted cultivation. Now, if you've ever taken any other class like sociology of the family or anything, you've probably heard something like concerted cultivation is actually a better parenting method than the opposite, which is natural growth, right? But Haidt challenges that a little bit, and I actually think it's quite an interesting critique of this method of parenting that has been pretty normalized, first among the middle and upper classes starting in the 1990s, but later, it's kind of spread to the kind of working class and the poor increasingly as well. And what is concerted cultivation? Well, basically in concerted cultivation, it's kind of like what it sounds like. Parents play a pivotal role in most of their kids' choices, activities, and everything, right? So parents plan activities, kids are overscheduled, parents are really, really involved in everything, and children in concerted cultivation tend to have a lot less free time, right? A lot of their time is structured because their parents are like, yeah, we're going to make a mathlete out of you yet, so we're going to drive you over to Kumon, 4 days a week after school, and make sure, and then to the violin lessons and all of that stuff, right? Parents really, really involved. Now, other aspects where risk has been stripped out is in the physical environment. Okay, so this is a picture of a playground. And if we're almost at the end of class, maybe if I remember, I will try to find, I had seen this YouTube video of the evolution of playgrounds. And this is kind of a modern playground. And if I'm being honest, it's super duper boring, right? It's actually the worst playground in the world because it's designed to be safe. And I see you nodding, and I know you get it. Because, there's all these little yellow fences everywhere so that you can't fall off and you can't really hurt yourself. And this slide is pathetic and sad. And it's designed out of plastic. And it's physically made to slow you down, right? Unless you can get enough snow on there, then you can really sail on that thing. But other than that, right, it stinks. This twirly slide is designed, oops, my calendar, I don't need that, so that you can go in it, but you can't really go on the side of it, right? Now, twirly slides in the 90s were different than this, right? They were all open on the edges. So what we used to do is we used to climb up along the edges. I have several scars on the back of my head where one time I fell off of it and hit my head in 2 places on the way down. And you know what I learned from that? Don't do that when it's snowing, right? Climbing the metal twirly slide when it's snowing will lead to concussions and stitches. So we learned things. But what happened, starting with the 90s, is we started to make everything safe, right? We started to become really concerned about the safety of children, often in ways that actually didn't make sense. There was a whole bunch of other things here. So if you remember, I'm going to take you all the way back to the beginning of the course, very early. Remember we were talking about Gen X? And they were the latchkey kids, right? Which meant that often they walked home after school, let themselves, even from the age of 5 or 6 years old, let themselves into the house, got a snack, and basically took care of themselves until mom and dad got home. In the 90s, there was this huge panic that sprung up about unsupervised kids, and especially right about kidnapping. That basically, and it was somewhat based on a few really prominent public cases where kids had been kidnapped by a complete stranger, and sometimes those kids had been found years later or had actually been killed. But parents reacted to this in a really weird way. It's like, oh my God, there's random kidnappers around, and we need to protect our parents from our kids from this. Our kids from this. And so things like after-school programs for kids became much more common. Out-of-school care became much more common, right? Where the kid would be shuttled from school to the after-school program with no gap in adult supervision. And then I remember a number of commercials and after-school specials that taught things like, I should go see if I can find them on YouTube, like what to do if a stranger pulls up to you and asks for directions. And it was like, step back, and if they try to grab you, fall down and scream, right? Now, I was well prepared for this by all of these commercials I saw while watching TV, but no one ever pulled up to me as a 12-year-old and was like, where's this address? Because why would you ask a child? Children don't know anything, right? So no one ever did ask me, but I was ready, for that moment in the 90s where a stranger pulled up to me and tried to kidnap me, which never happened. And weirdly, when you look at the statistics, in terms of kidnappings by strangers, it accounts for something like 0.01% of all kidnappings. All of the rest of them are parents and relatives, right? Much more likely to be kidnapped by your dad after your parents get divorced than by a complete stranger. So we started moving towards a philosophy that Haidt calls safetyism, right? Basically an obsession with child safety, and we start to strip a lot of the risk out of the lives of young people. And one of the things that we especially do is we start to think, and I'm going to erase this, we start to think that screen life is safe life. So we sort of encouraged our kids, instead of being out in the world where there were physical dangers, things they could learn from, right? Instead, to spend much more time at home on screens, assuming that screens are much safer for young people than the real world. So naturally what happens, young people start spending less and less time out in the real world. Okay, so safetyism and concerted cultivation means a lot less risk for young people, right? And risk is important. You need it to grow, right? You need to fail. You know, you might need to break your leg doing something dumb. I don't recommend it. Don't go out and do it today. But, you know, if you broke your leg and you recover from it, you'll realize you're okay, right? Now, the real world offers a lot of opportunities for risk and growth that is relatively, unproblematic. Phone-based or screen-based childhood, Haidt will say, does very little to foster anti-fragility, right, or resilience. So, for example, right, if you're playing Fortnite or any other game, right, I don't know if people still play Fortnite. I've heard Fortnite's kind of dying, but I've also been hearing that for 5 years. Bless you. You know, when you die in Fortnite, you don't really learn anything, right? There's really very little risk, but there's not a lot to learn from those failures, right? Compared to, you know, getting injured in the real world or getting into a fight with a friend, right? Much less to learn in that. Synchronous play has some risks. Most of the downsides can be redressed in real time, right? Particularly social aspects. If two kids get into a fight, right, you teach them how to work through their feelings and you kind of, you know, solve the problem. Everybody apologizes and all those things, right? If you remember kindergarten, that's what kindergarten was about, mitigating some of those real world risks. Social media is a little different, and maybe I'll talk about that next time, and I'll start by talking about social media. But a lot of the risks on social media can have major downsides, right? Especially socially and especially for girls. Okay, I'm out of time. I will leave it there. Off we go.